Billionaire's fiancée forced the maid to sleep outside in the heavy rain, until the billionaire found her. She lay in the freezing rain outside a mansion worth $40 million, soaked to the bone, while the woman inside watched through the glass and smiled. Nobody heard her cries except the storm. Nobody cared that she had nowhere else to go. But what that cruel woman didn't know was that the man walking up the driveway that night, the billionaire she was engaged to, was about to discover a secret that would destroy her perfect little world forever. And it all started with one soaking wet maid, lying in the mud. Welcome back, friends. Today's story is one of the most emotional and inspirational stories we've ever shared. A story about cruelty, dignity, and the kind of justice that comes when you least expect it. Stay until the end, because this story carries a life lesson you will never forget. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from? In a quiet, wealthy corner of Connecticut, behind iron gates and manicured hedges, stood the Whitfield estate, a house so large that some rooms hadn't been opened in years. Inside that house worked a woman named Maria Reyes, 26 years old, quiet, hardworking, and always the first to arrive and the last to leave. She never complained. She never asked for more than she was given. But Maria carried a secret in her heart, one she had never told a single soul in that house, not even the man she quietly, painfully, loved from a distance. Tonight, under a sky about to break open with rain, that secret would begin to unravel. And by the time the storm passed, nothing in the Whitfield mansion would ever be the same again. She thought it was just another ordinary night of cruelty. She had no idea it would change everything. Maria Reyes had worked at the Whitfield estate for almost 2 years. She'd come to Connecticut from a small town in Texas, sending most of her paycheck home to her ailing grandmother, the only family she had left. Her mother had passed away when Maria was 19, and her father had disappeared long before that. She grew up fast, learned to work hard, and never once let anyone see her cry, not even when it hurt the most. The Whitfield mansion belonged to Daniel Whitfield, a 34-year-old businessman who had built his real estate company from the ground up after inheriting a modest inheritance from his late father. Daniel was known around the city as sharp, driven, and fair to everyone who worked for him, a rare thing among men of his wealth. His employees respected him. His household staff adored him. And though Maria would never admit it, even to herself, she had feelings for him that went far deeper than any maid should feel for her employer. But Daniel was engaged. Her name was Victoria Sinclair, beautiful, polished, the daughter of a wealthy hotel family from Manhattan. To the outside world, Victoria was elegant and refined. But behind closed doors, in the private hallways of the Whitfield mansion, she was something else entirely. Cold, controlling, and cruel in ways that only the staff ever witnessed. Maria! Victoria's voice echoed down the marble staircase one afternoon. This dress has a wrinkle in it. Do you understand how much this dress cost? More than you'll make in a year. Maria said nothing. She simply took the dress and fixed it, her hand steady even as her chest tightened with humiliation. This was normal. This was every day. Victoria found something to criticize, something to demand, something to remind Maria of her place. The other staff members whispered about it in the kitchen when Victoria wasn't around. She treats her like she's nothing, said Rosa, the cook, shaking her head. I don't know how you put up with it, Maria. I need this job, Maria would always say quietly. My grandmother needs the money for her medicine. What none of them knew, what Maria had never told anyone, was that her connection to this house went back further than her 2 years of employment. Much further. But she had chosen silence because speaking the truth could cost her everything, and right now everything was all she had. Daniel, for his part, rarely witnessed Victoria's cruelty directly. Victoria was careful, calculated even, making sure her true nature only showed itself when Daniel was at the office or traveling for business. In front of him, she was sweet, affectionate, the perfect fiancée preparing for their wedding in the fall. But sometimes, just sometimes, Daniel noticed things. He noticed how Maria's eyes would drop the moment Victoria entered a room. He noticed how she flinched slightly whenever Victoria raised her voice. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself Victoria was simply particular, that Maria was simply shy. He was a busy man, consumed by contracts, deals, and the pressure of running a company his father had started from nothing. He didn't have time to look closer, but that was about to change. It was a Tuesday evening in early October when the sky over Connecticut turned the color of a fresh bruise, deep purples and grays rolling in from the coast. The weather forecast had warned of a serious storm, the kind that knocked out power lines and flooded streets. Rosa had already begun locking up the kitchen early, and the household staff were preparing to leave before the roads became dangerous. Maria was finishing her final task of the day, polishing the silverware in the dining room, when Victoria stormed in, her face twisted with fury, holding a small velvet box in her hand. "Where is it?" Victoria demanded. "My grandmother's emerald bracelet. It was in my jewelry box this morning, and now it's gone." Maria's heart dropped. "I haven't touched your jewelry box, Miss Sinclair. I would never." "Don't lie to me," Victoria snapped, stepping closer, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're the only one who has access to my room. That bracelet is worth more than your entire life, and you think you can just take it." "I didn't take anything," Maria said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, you can search my things. I've never stolen anything from this house, not once." But Victoria wasn't listening. Something dark had settled behind her eyes, something that went beyond a missing bracelet, something Maria couldn't understand. It was as if Victoria had been waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to unleash something she'd been holding back for a long time. Outside, the first drops of rain began to hit the windows, slow at first, then faster, harder, until the storm arrived in full force, rattling the glass and darkening the sky completely. "Get out," Victoria said, her voice suddenly quiet and cold, colder than her shouting had ever been. "Get your things and get out of this house tonight. Miss Sinclair, please, it's storming outside, I don't have anywhere." "I said get out." Victoria's scream echoed through the marble halls, and for the first time in 2 years, Maria saw something in Victoria's eyes that looked almost like fear, hidden beneath the rage. Fear of what Maria didn't know. Not yet. With shaking hands, Maria gathered her small bag from the staff quarters. Rosa tried to stop her, tried to offer her a ride, but Victoria had already ordered the front gate locked, ensuring no car could come in or out until morning. Maria had no phone credit left to call anyone. No family nearby. No shelter. She stepped out into the storm alone, the rain instantly soaking through her thin uniform, and made her way to the edge of the property, near the garden, where an old stone bench sat beneath a large oak tree, the closest thing to shelter she could find. She didn't know that 2 miles away, Daniel Whitfield had just left a business dinner early, feeling a strange, unexplainable urge to come home. What Daniel saw when he pulled into that driveway would break something inside him, and it was only the beginning. The storm had turned violent by the time Daniel's car approached the estate. Rain hammered against the windshield so hard his driver could barely see the road. Daniel sat in the back seat, phone in hand, half listening to a voicemail from his business partner, half distracted by an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. He'd left the dinner early, something he never did, telling his associates he wasn't feeling well. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, all evening, He'd had this nagging sense that something was wrong at home. He told himself it was foolish. He told himself he was just tired. But the feeling didn't go away, and eventually he gave in to it. As the car turned onto the long driveway, the headlights swept across the front lawn, and that's when he saw her. A figure curled up on the wet grass near the garden wall, barely visible through the sheets of rain. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a stray dog seeking shelter. But as the car slowed, he realized with a jolt of horror that it was a person. Woman. "Stop the car," Daniel said sharply. He didn't wait for his driver to fully stop before he threw open the door and ran out into the storm. His expensive suit instantly soaked through. As he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. Maria. She was lying curled on her side, shivering violently, her uniform clinging to her skin, her lips tinged blue from the cold. Her eyes were half closed, exhaustion and cold having drained the strength from her body. Maria. He dropped to his knees beside her, ignoring the mud soaking into his pants. Maria, can you hear me? What happened? Why are you out here? She stirred weakly, blinking up at him through rain-soaked lashes. Mr. Whitfield, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Don't apologize, he said, his voice breaking with something between anger and fear. Just tell me what happened. Who did this to you? But before Maria could answer, a voice called out from the mansion's front entrance. Daniel looked up to see Victoria standing in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, watching the scene unfold with an expression that made his blood run cold. It wasn't concern on her face. It wasn't worry. It was something closer to satisfaction, a coldness Daniel had never seen in her before, and it terrified him more than the storm itself. Victoria, he called out, lifting Maria carefully into his arms despite her weak protests that she could walk. What is going on here? Why is Maria outside in this storm? Victoria crossed her arms, unmoved by the sight of her fiancé cradling a soaked, shivering Maid in his arms. She stole from me, Daniel. My grandmother's bracelet. I told her to leave. You locked her outside. In a storm like this. Daniel's voice rose with disbelief. Victoria, she could have died out here. She's a servant, Daniel, not a guest, Victoria said coolly. I don't understand why you're making this into such a dramatic scene. Something inside Daniel shifted in that moment, a crack forming in the image he'd built of the woman he was supposed to marry. He said nothing more to Victoria. He simply carried Maria inside, past her, into the warmth of the house, calling for Rosa, who had stayed late finishing kitchen duties and rushed forward the moment she saw them. Get blankets, warm water, anything, Daniel ordered, laying Maria gently on the couch in the sitting room. His hands were trembling, though he told himself it was just the cold. As Rosa hurried to help, Daniel knelt beside Maria, brushing wet hair from her face with a tenderness that surprised even him. You're safe now, he said softly. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Maria's eyes fluttered open, tears mixing with the rain still dripping from her hair. Why do you care? She whispered. I'm just the maid. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest at those words. You're not just anything, he said quietly. You never have been. It was in that moment, kneeling beside her on the floor of his own living room, that Daniel Whitfield realized something he had been avoiding for a long time. His feelings for Maria weren't simple concern for an employee. They ran far deeper than that, deeper than he had ever allowed himself to admit, even to himself. But there was something else in that room that night, something neither of them noticed in the chaos of the moment. As Rosa wrapped a blanket around Maria's shoulders, A small object slipped from the inside pocket of her soaked uniform and clattered softly onto the hardwood floor. Locket. Old, tarnished silver, shaped like an oval, with a tiny engraving on the back that Daniel would have recognized anywhere, if only he had looked closely enough. But his attention was entirely on Maria, on making sure she was warm, safe, breathing steadily. He didn't see the locket. Not yet. Victoria did. Standing in the doorway, watching from a distance, Victoria's eyes locked onto that small silver object gleaming on the floor, and her face went pale, not with concern, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked away into the shadows of the house, her mind racing, her carefully constructed world beginning, for the first time, to feel unsteady beneath her feet. Because Victoria Sinclair knew exactly what that locket meant. And if Daniel ever found out the truth it represented, everything she had built, her engagement, her future, her carefully hidden past, would come crashing down around her. What would you do if you were in Maria's place? Holding a secret powerful enough to change everything, but terrified of what the truth might cost you. By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the estate glistening under a pale autumn sun as if nothing had happened at all. But inside the Whitfield mansion, everything had changed. Daniel had insisted Maria stay in one of the guest rooms rather than return to the staff quarters, a decision that raised eyebrows among the household, but one he refused to reconsider. He checked on her twice that morning himself, bringing her tea, making sure Rosa had prepared proper food, treating her not like an employee, but like someone precious. Victoria noticed. Course she noticed. And it filled her with a quiet, simmering rage that she carefully hid behind polite smiles whenever Daniel was near. But something else was consuming Victoria's thoughts that morning. Something far more urgent than jealousy. The locket. She had lain awake most of the night thinking about it, about what it meant, about the truth she had buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it didn't exist anymore. 15 years ago, before Victoria Sinclair became the polished heiress the world knew today, her family's hotel business had been on the verge of collapse. Her father, Richard Sinclair, had been business partners with a man named Alejandro Reyes, a hard-working, honest immigrant who had helped build the Sinclair hotel chain from 3 struggling properties into a respected regional brand. Alejandro had been more than a business partner. He'd been the mind behind the company's most successful ideas, the one who worked tirelessly while Richard Sinclair took the credit and the profits. When the company faced a financial crisis, Richard made a choice that would haunt the Sinclair family for years, even if the world never knew it. He forged documents, framing Alejandro for embezzlement that Richard himself had committed, using it as an excuse to force Alejandro out of the partnership entirely, without a cent of the profits he was owed. Alejandro fought back quietly, without lawyers he couldn't afford, without the connections Richard had. He lost everything: his reputation, his savings, eventually his health. He died 3 years later, broken-hearted, leaving behind a young daughter and a wife who would herself pass away not long after from grief and exhaustion, working multiple jobs just to survive. That daughter's name was Maria Reyes. Victoria had been only 12 years old when it happened, too young to fully understand what her father had done. But she'd grown up hearing whispered conversations, catching fragments of guilt-ridden confessions her father made late at night when he thought no one was listening. She'd pieced together the truth slowly, over years, until she understood exactly what her family's wealth had been built upon: the ruin of an honest man and his family. The locket had belonged to Alejandro Reyes. Victoria remembered it from childhood photographs, a gift Alejandro had given his wife, engraved with their wedding date, later passed down to Maria after her mother's passing. Victoria had seen that exact locket in a photograph buried in her father's old business files years ago, files she'd found while searching for something else entirely, files that contain the truth about what really happened to Alejandro Reyes. Which meant Maria Reyes wasn't just some maid who happened to work in the Whitfield household. She was the daughter of the man Victoria's father had destroyed. And if Daniel, sharp, principled, deeply loyal Daniel, ever discovered that connection, ever learned what the Sinclair family had truly done, everything Victoria had worked so hard to build would collapse instantly. Worse still, Victoria realized with growing dread, was the deeper truth hidden beneath all of it. Daniel's own father years ago had been the one who quietly, secretly, helped fund Alejandro's initial legal fight against Richard Sinclair, before Alejandro gave up the fight out of exhaustion and shame. Daniel didn't know this history. His father had passed away without ever telling him. But if the truth ever surfaced, if Daniel ever learned that his own family had once tried to help Maria's father seek justice against the very family he was now marrying into, the wedding, the merger of their business empires, everything would be destroyed. Victoria found Maria alone that afternoon in the guest room, sitting by the window, still pale from the previous night's ordeal. She closed the door behind her quietly, her expression unreadable. "That locket," Victoria said without preamble, her voice low. "It belonged to your father, Alejandro Reyes." Maria's face went white. In 2 years of working at the Whitfield estate, she had never once mentioned her father's name, never once revealed her connection to the Sinclair family's dark history. She had taken this job in Connecticut deliberately, searching quietly for answers about the family that had destroyed her father, never expecting to fall into the orbit of the very man whose father had tried to help. "How do you know that name?" Maria whispered. "Because my father is the reason your father died penniless and broken," Victoria said, her voice trembling with something that might have been shame, though buried deep beneath years of denial. "I've known for years what my family did to yours. And I have spent years making sure nobody ever finds out." Maria stood slowly, her hands shaking, not from cold this time, but from the weight of a truth she'd carried alone for so long. "So this is why you've hated me from the moment I started working here," she said quietly. "You knew who I was all along." "I didn't know until I saw the locket last night," Victoria admitted. "I suspected. Your last name, your face. You look so much like the photographs I found. But I told myself it was coincidence, because the alternative was too dangerous to consider." "Dangerous for who?" Maria asked. "For me. I lost everything because of your family. My father. My mother. I grew up in poverty because your father destroyed an honest man to save his own reputation." "Dangerous for both of us," Victoria said sharply. "If Daniel finds out, he will destroy my family's business out of principle alone. And you? Do you think he'll ever trust you again once he learns you've been hiding this from him for 2 years? He'll think you came here for revenge, for money, for some hidden agenda. He'll never believe it was coincidence." Maria felt the truth of those words settle heavily in her chest. Victoria was right in a horrible way. If Daniel learned the truth now, after everything, would he believe her intentions were pure? Or would he see betrayal where there was only grief and a daughter's quiet search for closure? "What do you want from me?" Maria asked finally. Victoria's eyes hardened with desperate resolve. "I want you gone. Not just from this house. From Connecticut. From Daniel's life entirely. I'll give you money. More than enough to take care of your grandmother for years, more than you'd ever make working here. But you need to disappear before the wedding, and you need to make sure Daniel never learns the truth about who you are." Before Maria could respond, the door opened. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face frozen, his eyes moving slowly between the two women. He had come to check on Maria, as he had all morning, and had caught the final devastating words of Victoria's ultimatum. "What?" he said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. is going on here? What would you do if you were in Daniel's place, discovering that everyone around you had been hiding the truth, and one choice would determine who you could ever trust again? The silence in the room stretched unbearably long. Victoria's face drained of color, her carefully constructed composure crumbling for the first time Daniel had ever witnessed. Maria stood frozen, torn between 2 years of careful silence and the sudden, undeniable pull toward honesty. "Someone needs to explain this to me right now," Daniel said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him. "What money? What truth? What is she gone from Connecticut?" Victoria opened her mouth, searching desperately for an explanation that wasn't the truth, but nothing came. For the first time in her life, she had no plan, no polished response prepared in advance. It was Maria who finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "My name is Maria Reyes," she said. "My father was Alejandro Reyes. 15 years ago, he was business partners with Victoria's father, Richard Sinclair." Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to something more careful, more alert. "I've heard that name before," he said slowly. "Alejandro Reyes. My father mentioned him once, a long time ago, before he passed away. He said something about a man who'd been wronged, someone he'd tried to help but couldn't in the end. Your father tried to help mine fight the case against Richard Sinclair," Maria continued, tears filling her eyes now as years of buried grief finally found a voice. "Richard forged documents accusing my father of embezzlement to force him out of the partnership without paying him what he was owed. My father fought back as long as he could, but he didn't have the resources, the lawyers, the connections that Richard had. He lost everything. He died 3 years later, broken-hearted. My mother followed not long after, worn down from working multiple jobs just trying to survive." Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes moving to Victoria, who stood silently, unable to meet his gaze. "Is this true?" he asked her directly. "Daniel, please, you have to understand." "Is it true?" he repeated, louder this time, the betrayal in his voice unmistakable. Victoria's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her entirely. "Yes," she whispered. "It's true. My father destroyed her family to save his own business. I've known for years, and I've spent those years making sure no one ever found out, because I knew what it would mean for my family, for our business, for everything." "And you knew Maria was his daughter," Daniel said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "That's why you've treated her this way since the day she started working here. That's why you locked her outside in a storm last night." "I panicked," Victoria admitted, tears finally spilling down her face, though whether from genuine remorse or the fear of losing everything, even she couldn't have said for certain. "When I saw the locket, I knew, and I was terrified of what would happen if you found out. I told her to leave because I was scared, Daniel. Scared of losing you, losing everything we've built." Daniel turned to Maria, his expression softening slightly, though confusion and hurt still lingered in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. 2 years, Maria. 2 years of working in this house, and you never once mentioned any of this." Maria wiped her eyes, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since the truth had come spilling out. "Because I didn't come here for revenge or money or anything like that," she said. "I came here because after my mother passed away, I found old letters among her belongings. Letters from your father to mine, apologizing for not being able to help more, offering whatever support he could. I wanted to understand my father's story better, to find some kind of closure. I never expected to fall in love with the family, or the man connected to it all." The word hung in the air between them, love, spoken without hesitation, without calculation, simply the raw truth finally breaking free after 2 years of careful silence. Daniel felt something shift deep in his chest, a mixture of overwhelming emotions he couldn't fully untangle in that moment. Grief for a past he'd never known, anger at Victoria's deception, and something warmer, something that had been quietly growing inside him since the night before, when he'd knelt beside Maria in the rain and felt an urgency to protect her that went far beyond simple concern for an employee. "I need time to process all of this," Daniel said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Victoria, I think it's best if you leave the house for now. We'll discuss the wedding and everything else once I've had a chance to think clearly. Daniel, please don't let this destroy everything You let an innocent woman sleep outside in a storm because you were protecting a secret about your father's crimes," Daniel said, his voice hardening with quiet finality. "That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you truly are, Victoria. I need time. Please just go." Victoria left the room without another word, her carefully constructed world finally, completely collapsing around her. The consequences of a lie she'd inherited from her father now costing her everything she'd built her future upon. Daniel turned back to Maria, the room quiet except for the soft sound of her lingering tears. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for everything my family's history put yours through. For not seeing sooner what was happening in my own house." "You have nothing to apologize for," Maria said. "None of this was your doing." Daniel stepped closer, reaching out gently to take her hand. "Maria, whatever happens next with the business, with Victoria, with all of this complicated history between our families, I want you to know that what I feel for you isn't complicated at all. It's the simplest, clearest thing I've felt in years." Maria looked up at him, her heart pounding, hardly daring to believe the words she was hearing. "Daniel, You don't have to say anything right now," he said gently. "Just know that I see you, Maria. I've seen you for a while now, even when I didn't fully understand why. And I'm not going to let you disappear from my life. Not now, not ever." Outside the window, the sun broke fully through the clouds for the first time since the storm, casting warm golden light across the estate's gardens. The same gardens where, just hours before, Maria had lain shivering and alone, believing she had nowhere left to turn. Some storms destroy everything in their path. Others clear the way for something beautiful to finally grow. 6 months passed. The engagement between Daniel and Victoria was formally called off within a week of that stormy night, the news quietly making its way through Connecticut's social circles, though the true reasons behind it remained known only to those directly involved. Victoria left the state entirely, moving to start fresh somewhere far from the wreckage of her family's hidden history, though she did, eventually, reach out to Maria with a genuine apology. One Maria chose, after much reflection, to accept, understanding that Victoria had inherited a burden of guilt she never asked for, even if she'd handled it poorly. Richard Sinclair's business dealings were quietly investigated once Daniel, with Maria's blessing, brought the old forged documents to light through proper legal channels. Alejandro Reyes's name was finally cleared, 15 years after his death, restoring the reputation that had been unjustly stolen from him. It wasn't the same as having him alive to see it, Maria often thought, but it was enough to bring a kind of peace she hadn't realized she'd been missing for years. Daniel used a portion of his own company's resources to establish a scholarship fund in Alejandro Reyes's name, supporting the children of immigrant business owners who'd faced similar injustices, a gesture that meant more to Maria than any apology or financial settlement ever could have. As for Maria and Daniel, their relationship grew slowly, carefully, built on the honesty that had finally broken free that stormy October night. Maria no longer worked as a maid in the Whitfield household. Daniel had insisted on that from the beginning, though it took considerable convincing for Maria to accept help of any kind, having spent so many years relying only on herself. Instead, using the education she'd once had to abandon after her parents' deaths, Maria enrolled in business courses, eventually finding her footing in a career that honored the sharp, hard-working spirit her father had once brought to his own work, decades before. Rosa, the kind-hearted cook who'd offered comfort during the darkest moments, remained close with Maria, often laughing about how she'd always suspected there was something special about the quiet young woman who worked so hard and complained so little. On a warm spring evening, almost exactly 1 year after that terrible storm, Daniel brought Maria back to that same spot in the garden, the stone bench beneath the old oak tree where she had once lain alone, cold and believing herself forgotten by the world. This time, the sky was clear, filled with the soft golden light of sunset, and Daniel knelt not to lift her from the rain-soaked ground, but to ask her, with trembling hands and an open heart, to spend the rest of her life by his side. Maria said yes through tears of joy, standing in the very place where her lowest moment had once unfolded, now transformed into the site of her greatest happiness. Their wedding, held later that year, was a small, intimate gathering, nothing like the extravagant affair once planned with Victoria. Rosa cried through the entire ceremony. Maria's grandmother, whose health had improved thanks to the care Maria could finally afford to provide, sat proudly in the front row, watching her granddaughter marry a man who had seen her worth even when the world had tried to convince her she had none. In his wedding speech, Daniel spoke words that would stay with everyone who heard them that day. "I once believed that the measure of a person was found in their success, their wealth, the empire they built. But I learned, through the darkest storm of my life, that true worth is found in kindness, honesty, and the quiet strength to keep going even when the world gives you every reason to give up. Maria taught me that, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful that one stormy night brought her into my arms, and never let her go." The story of Maria Reyes and Daniel Whitfield became, in a quiet way, a reminder to everyone who knew them of a simple but powerful truth, that dignity cannot be stripped away by cruelty, no matter how hard someone tries. That the darkest nights often carry within them the seeds of the greatest transformations. And that sometimes, the very people the world overlooks are the ones destined for the most extraordinary journeys. Maria never forgot the feeling of lying alone in that storm, believing herself abandoned and unseen. But she also never forgot the moment Daniel's headlights swept across the lawn, the moment someone finally chose to stop, to kneel down in the mud beside her, and to see her, truly see her, for the first time. And that, in the end, made all the difference. If this story touched your heart today, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspirational stories, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way home. And tell us in the comments, what part of Maria and Daniel's story moved you the most? We read every single comment, and we can't wait to hear from you.